Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Friday Night Drive podcast. This is Josh Welge, joined by Steve Soucie, as we get ready for week 2 in the Illinois high school football season. And as we tape this, Steve, on Wednesday, it's one of those things that last week was so exciting, and I was purely exhausted by the end of the weekend, needing a break. But, usually when I get to Wednesday afternoon, I'm kind of ready for some more football. How are you feeling? And, what's your thoughts going into week 2?
Yeah, it's one of the crazier weeks because you go all that time where you're just speculating on what things are. And for me, who loves data, finally I'm getting data. So I've been pouring through that over the last couple of days and finally got it sorted out to where I feel like I have a pretty good handle on what actually happened in week 1. But like you, it's the middle of the week, and I'm ready for a refresh. I'm ready for some more. I'm ready for some more answers to some more questions that I had that bore out of what happened in week 1. I mean, and there were a lot of teams out there that had some statement victories. There were a few that had some statement losses, and I need to find out how relevant those things are over the course of the entire season. Was it a blip, or is this the new normal? So it's it's a very interesting thing to have to watch. But yeah, like you, usually we get around Wednesday and especially Thursday. I'm like, yeah, let's get going. Let's get us another week of football here.
Yeah. As I said, we're taping this on Wednesday, and Steve's, he mentioned data. Steve's latest playoff projections dropped on FridayNightDrive.com today. So you want to check it out. And Steve, as I was looking it over, one thing that I noticed, and again, we've only played one game, but the big conversation last year was the number of 4 and 5 teams that made the playoffs, and there's a handful. And obviously, one of them, Nazareth, notably went on to win the state title. Looking at your early projections, you think that we might be seeing a few more, if not a lot more, 4 and 5 teams. Without sharing how many you think, because it's still so early, what are some of the reasons that you're seeing about why this could become an even more commonplace phenomenon?
Well, there are 3 major things that are involved in this. One, once again, we're at a situation where we have less than 500 playoff eligible teams in the state right now. We're at 494, to be completely honest with you. So when you need 256 teams, and once you're out of the segment of the season where you're playing less and less out-of-state opponents, there's only about 250 teams a week that are going to get a win in a given week. So the odds of us getting 256 of those teams that have at least 5 wins, that continues to decrease because of just simple mathematics. I think we're definitely going to get some 4-win teams in. And then on top of it, I just mentioned the out-of-state teams. This year, we saw a little bit lesser of a trend in that. Usually in the non-conference season, we have a lot more of these out-of-state games where teams are playing teams from Missouri or teams from Indiana or Wisconsin. There were some this year, but there were less. And like we talked about last week, some of these premier programs kind of gave up on the out-of-state experience and just settled in with another Illinois opponent. So that's one less potential win that an Illinois team can collect in those weeks. So there's just less wins to go around now because there are less programs. And then the third thing was a realignment of the Chicago Public League. Last year we had 27 teams make the playoffs from the Chicago Public League. And based on the way that they restructured their divisions, there are now 4 divisions at the bottom of the Chicago Public League that have 6 teams each, where the only qualifier that can come out of that division is the winner of that conference. So essentially, when I said there was 494 teams fighting for those spots, in reality, it's actually 474 because there are 20 teams from the Chicago Public League that have no path to getting to the playoffs if they don't win one of those divisions. So they can't get an at-large berth. They can't get in at 6-3 or 5-4 or 7-2. They have to win the division. So there's actually 20 less teams on the board. So that's leading to a real, I think, opening of the gates in regards of letting 4-win teams in. I would be stunned if it's not in double digits this year.
What caused the public league to that shift in their teams getting made to playoffs? how did we get there with that? That's the one I was reading. I'm thinking, I wonder why that is.
Well, I mean, if you look at the data over year, the public league teams on large mass are not doing very well in the state playoffs.
Yeah.
And that's being kind. A lot of these scores are really lopsided. So I believe it was 3 years ago, they went to a system where they took the 16 best teams in their opinion and kind of put them all in their own divisions. Where they're playing each other, trying to get themselves a little bit more in tune with what it will take to be in Congress to making the playoffs. But that kind of had a twofold effect. The same teams were still getting through the playoffs, but some of your better Chicago Public League teams weren't, because they had to play the upper echelons public league teams. They used to be more evenly distributed. So I think the reason that they did that was they wanted to keep that way structured for the Red, but the divisions underneath them were producing some really poor playoff teams. So they made it a lot harder for those teams to get a playoff berth. Certainly some of those teams might break through and they might have a pretty good football team, but the grand majority of them that were making the playoffs for them were largely getting running clocked, beaten badly in those playoff games. So I think in the long run, this is a good thing for everybody, because some of those classifications were getting really cluttered with a lot of public league teams that didn't have much of a chance of actually winning those playoff games. And you'd get situations like last year where you'd have Nazareth and Prairie Ridge playing a first-round playoff game, and then right below them on the playoff draw were a pair of public league teams that wouldn't get within 50 points of either one of those two teams just above them on the bracket. So I think in the long run, this is better for the quality of the playoffs. It's just going to be strange and take some time getting used to the fact that there's going to be a lot more teams when we look at that bracket with the seasonal records that have 4 and 5 records on them in the actual fields themselves.
Yeah, like you said, ironically, more teams with losing records in the playoffs could potentially make for a more competitive playoffs. Just kind of looking at that. I mean, I totally agree with you about some of the outcomes that we saw last year for playoffs with some of those public league results. A really good read. Everybody wants to check that out. Obviously, look at the projections. Everybody's interested in that, but just also some of the the story is a good read. I encourage everyone to check it out. Again, on FridayNightDrive.com, Steve's playoff projections as we sit here. Again, we're looking at week 2. A lot of great games on tap, and I want to start with some of the games that are involving CCL, ESCC games. I want to bring in Michael Duwojak, who covers that league for our company on Friday Night Drive. Michael, how you doing? And how was week 1 for you? You had a kind of a busy weekend there.
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me, guys. Happy to make my debut this year. Week 1 was fun. It was busy. Obviously, Susie and I saw 2 games together. We saw the Mount Carmel Huns game and East St. Louis Loyola game, and I had Phillips and Brother Rice sandwiched in there with a big Crusaders win there. But it was good. It's fun. Obviously, it's a lot of football to start things off. I think we got a lot of fun games to kind of start the year. So that was it was fun to kind of get things started.
Looking at to week 2, one of the marquee games on the league schedule, Brother Rice playing Marist, big rivalry there. Brother Rice, they're a team that I know you like a lot. I know Steve likes a lot to really make some noise this year. And of course, Marist, Mike Fitzgerald coming home to Marist. He had a lot of success at Marist as an offensive coordinator. Winning a state title there, and then of course he did great things at York, and now he's back. What's your thoughts going into that game on Friday? I believe you're going to be there.
Yeah, I'll be at that game on Friday. The Battle of Pulaski is always a fun game. Yeah, obviously neighborhood rivalry schools, just a couple blocks separated on Pulaski. Obviously, we got the question because that might be one of the top games in the state this upcoming week. And it's always interesting because I feel like it's so cliche to say, throw out the record books when you have a rivalry game like this, but it does kind of feel like that, especially since this game is happening in week 2. Obviously, Brother Rice won 50-0 last week against Phillips, but the offense only played the first half. They got limited snaps. Coach Casey Quentenfeld actually was kind of disappointed because he felt like they had too many penalties, and offensively. I think they only ended up scoring 34 points, and the rest was a safety and a couple defensive touchdowns. But the big thing with them is just, offensively, they're so young. They're still trying to figure things out. CJ Gray comes in as a quarterback. You got Tyler Lofton transferring into the program as their running back. A lot of offensive talent, but they're also trying to come together. So Marist will be a pretty tough test. You obviously saw what they were able to do against Morgan Park in week 1. Obviously, they've got Brad Fitzgibbon, an Iowa commit. They got Archieles Anderson, a Harvard commit. That defense was really good against Morgan Park and, limiting what they're able to do. So I think it'll be a really interesting matchup, and I'm curious to see, what Seuss thinks about it as well. But it does feel like a matchup that's going to be decided by a field goal, maybe a late touchdown, maybe 4 points, and then a strong defensive stop either by Brother Rice or Marist.
What were your impressions, Michael? I know you didn't get to see them for very long, but with a full strength Brother Rice team on the field, because I know last year, obviously there were times where they just didn't have all their personnel, all their elite personnel at their disposal. I guess what was it? Even though it was a limited amount of time, particularly, what were your impressions of the Brother Rice defense? In my mind,
I think the defense just, when it's healthy, it's great. I mean, you've got so many talents everywhere. Obviously, it starts with Christian Pierce as its leading linebacker. You've got talent on the inside of the line and the outside of the line. You got Connor Steck, King Liggins, so many other talented guys in the secondary as well. So you've just got a team where a defense that's just really strong. And if they're all on the field, I don't really see how you can run against this defense. Maybe you could pass a little bit, but that secondary is really good too. So it'll be a really interesting test for, Marist, obviously, with Jacob Ritter taking over at quarterback. They got John McAuliffe, who's obviously a talented running back who also, is a pass-catching threat. It'll be interesting to see because Marist will face a tough test against this defense that, really limits you and takes away the run. And once you take away the run, obviously you can really focus on the pass game as well. So, once healthy, obviously that Brother Rice defense is great. We didn't get to see them fully against Phillips just because of how out of hand the game kind of got pretty quickly. But from what we were able to see pretty early, that defense looked as good as advertised.
Another good rivalry game in the CCL this weekend, Mount Carmel playing at St Rita. Mount Carmel, kind of a unique situation coming in off of a loss, albeit if that wasn't the game of the weekend on Thursday night, it's in the short list, that game with the Hunt School. You were there on Thursday night. I admittedly don't know as much about St Rita. What are you looking at with that matchup, Michael?
I think we're all still trying to figure out a little bit more about St Rita. Obviously they picked up it was kind of close, and then they ended up winning, I think it was by 10 points against Sandburg. So that was a good start to the season for the Mustangs, especially kind of a closer rivalry game. But yeah, I think we're still trying to figure out a little bit more about the St Rita team. The offense obviously has a new quarterback. Nick Herman comes back obviously as a key running back, but we're still trying to learn more. And it was funny just listening to, Matt Muka, Mount Carmel's linebacker, talking about that Hun game. Obviously, Mount Carmel gave up 42 points. That's the most points that they gave up since 2018 as a defense. So, it'll be really interesting to see because he said, I wouldn't want to be our week 2 opponent. And that's exactly what St. Rita is this week. So it'll be interesting. This rivalry has kind of been a little bit lopsided the last couple matchups with Mount Carmel getting the best out of St. Rita. But, it'll be really interesting to see, especially early, if St. Rita can kind of limit that offense or whether Mount Carmel is just going to do what it did last week and just end up with a big win.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm, really eager to see, how Mount Carmel responds, and then also to see what St. Rita is all about. Obviously, stepping out playing Mount Carmel in week 2. A Saturday matchup that I'm going to be at, Loyola is at Glenbard West. Loyola, their Saturday game is kind of one of the more eye-opening results of week 1, I would say. Loyola having their 19-game winning streak, snapped against East St. Louis Saturday night down at Illinois State. They go to Glenbard West, who actually also lost their week 1 game as well last Saturday, Pavia. Michael, what's your thoughts on just Loyola, particularly, going into that and just kind of where they're at?
It was interesting because, watching that game on Saturday night, I feel like I said this to Seuss a couple times, but that felt like the most disorganized and kind of disheveled that I've ever seen Loyola, just based on offensively, just like with what East St. Louis was able to do to them, like you could see that kind of rocked them with their pressure, with their speed, with their size. And, Loyola's not used to that. They have an offensive line that usually protects them pretty well. Like the running, joke has been like you can throw back whoever back there. That offensive line is just going to protect them, and they'll do a good job running the ball no matter who the running back is. But obviously against East St. Louis, it didn't really happen. But it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, Glenbard West gave Pavia a really good game in the first week to start things off. And, it's kind of the same mindset where maybe Loyola didn't really say this, but I wouldn't want to play Loyola in week 2, specifically because Loyola hasn't lost a back-to-back game since 2018. And they're not really used to a loss like that. That was their biggest loss since 2018 as well. So it'll be really interesting. I don't think, if they were playing anyone else or mostly anyone else, I would say that this would probably be a blowout win for Loyola. But Glenbard West, they can challenge them. And based on what we saw from that offense for Loyola, that's something that I'm really interested to see. How are they going to respond? Because they did not look good on Saturday at all. They have an experienced quarterback, obviously, in Ryan Fitzgerald, who's going to be a walk-on at Iowa. Drew McPherson is a running back who has a scholarship at Iowa. So they have talent on this offense. It's just putting it together. And other than the 50-yard run, we didn't see that offense look good at all against East St. Louis. So I'm curious to see, can they regroup and can they kind of get better against a pretty talented, Glenbard West defense?
Yeah, and on the opposite end, Steve was there for this as well. Like Glenbard West, Pavia, there was several times in that game that I thought the game could get away from Glenbard West. Pavia led by a couple touchdowns on a few occasions, but to Glenbard West's credit, they were able to hang around to the end, and they almost were able to, maybe tie it and go to overtime. Significantly for Glenbard West, their best offensive player, Tayon Oriental, a senior running back, he left the game on the second to last drive of the game with, I talked to him afterwards, looked like he had a hand injury, wasn't sure the extent of that, but if they don't have him, he is an enormous part of their offense. He's a game breaker. He's a guy that can make plays for them. So that will be something to watch as we look forward to that game. And Glenbard West, man, Steve, you touched on your podcast with Matt Rodewald earlier this week. If there is a more difficult first 4 games schedule of the season, I don't know what it is with Glenbard West.
Yeah, it really is kind of ridiculous. They follow these two games to start the season. Then they have Downers Grove North. Then they have Lions. Downers Grove North, a top 10 team in the Friday Night Drive power rankings. Lions, I just put them in this week after their win over Prospect in week 1. That is one heck of a gauntlet. But, like we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast here, obviously, if you're Glenbard West, you don't want to dig yourself too big of a hole here. But it is survivable more this year than I think it has ever been. If that does end up if they end up coming out of it, let's just say for our sake of argument, 1-3 or God forbid 0-4, there's still a window there that maybe didn't exist in the past.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And yeah, we'll see. That is, when we first saw the schedule in July, I said to myself, wow, that's a really first 4 games. And then the way Lions Township looked week 1, beating Prospect, I thought, wow, that's even more difficult. So yeah, we'll see. It should be a fun one on Saturday, Loyola at Glenbard West. Mike, before we let you get out of here, what are some other games involving CCL teams that you're really keeping an eye on this weekend?
I think the biggest game I'm kind of interested in, keeping an eye on is probably going to be St Ignatius and Fenwick. Mostly, other than, it being a rivalry game, these two teams like to really clashed in the white division before they kind of changed divisions with Ignatius going to the blue. I'm just kind of curious just to see what St. Ignatius is at this point. Obviously, they had a huge 40-point win against the team from Milwaukee, so it's kind of tough to tell, exactly, what that means in the grand scheme of things. But I am interested. Obviously, St. Ignatius doesn't have Justin Scott anymore. He's with Miami, at the University of Miami. So, but they're still going to run that, triple option offense. They're still got a lot of guys that have kind of grown into the program, and obviously they had more talent other than just Justin Scott last year. So I'm really interested just to see what they're going to look like against the Fenwick team that has talent as well. Obviously, Nate Marshall, he's going to Auburn. He's a very talented defensive end, and as we saw in week 1, he's a pass catching threat as well. And obviously you have Jack Paris, who's a big defender for Fenwick. And Tommy Thies is also very good for Fenwick. So these are two talented teams. I'm really interested to see how, who kind of comes out in that one, because if St. Ignatius can come out in that one, I think that's really good momentum to start the year. Obviously, they'll have a tough task in starting the blue. But if they can start the season 2-1, 3-0, even heading into that blue matchup, I think that'll be really interesting. But that's my top matchup. Obviously, going to keep track of other games. Obviously, Kenwood and Nazareth are going to play against each other. Interested to see how Nazareth kind of responds after playing in a tight game in week 1 against Kankakee. I'm always going to keep looking at Carmel just to see what Trey Taylor is doing, because he already had an impressive first week, only played 1 half and threw 4 touchdowns and made it look pretty easy. So obviously going to keep tabs on them. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of good storylines in the mega conference. Maybe not as exciting as a week as we had in week 1, but a pretty good week 2 slate before we really get things started in week 3 and week 4.
Yeah, I feel like Trey Taylor is sort of like Jonas Williams the first couple of years, that even if you're not paying attention to him, he's still out of the corner of your eye. You just want to keep an eye, because you never know what he might be doing, except it's going to be doing a lot of good things. So
yeah, he's definitely going to do a lot of good stuff. And obviously that Carmel team is more than Trey Taylor. Obviously we got Devontae Ellis and a lot of great guys there that Jason McKee and a lot of former Bears are running over there. So that'll be a really fun team to kind of keep track of throughout the year.
That's Michael DeWoljek. You can follow him at mdewoljek94. He has his CCL ESCC notebook that dropped today on Wednesday. A lot of good stuff. I read it. Really great stuff. You'll want to be following him this weekend. I'll be at the Battle Pulaski Friday, and that'll be covering the Bears this weekend. So a very busy weekend for Michael. You want to give him a follow. Michael, thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks for having me, guys.
Michael.
Steve, as we look ahead to some of the other games this weekend, one game involving a CCL team that we didn't touch on with Michael that, I'm kind of interested in, Joliet Catholic playing Oswego. Oswego coming off of a very, impressive week 1 win over Neuqua Valley. Joliet Catholic beat a team from Iowa as well. I talked to Coach Brian Cooney from Oswego, and I said, when's the last time you guys played them? And he wasn't sure, but he was bringing up the name Mike Alstad involving Joliet Catholic. And if people don't know who Mike Alstad was, you might want to look him up. He played for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but it's been a while. But I'm really looking forward to that matchup, just to see, if Oswego can kind of step up and play at that level against a team like Joliet Catholic. What are you looking at for that one?
Yeah, it was a really interesting situation with that game in particular. I looked at it. That game didn't actually get scheduled until, I believe, sometime in mid-May. Which, if you're unfamiliar with how the scheduling process works, that's really, really late. And it was a situation that was kind of hatched out of both teams kind of needing a game. And we've talked about this a lot, basically just saying, well, we're both going to have to play a good football team. And I just, out of curiosity, while we were talking here, I actually heard you make mention of that. The answer to your question of when Oswego and Joliet Catholic played last, 1989 is the answer. So that's it's a long time since these two teams have played. When I originally heard about this game being scheduled, I wasn't sure if I liked it too much from Oswego's perspective, but the more I learned about Oswego, I think they're using this as a really good opportunity to take a measuring stick of themselves. How good really can they be? And challenging themselves in playing Joliet Catholic will certainly provide that opportunity. So I'm a lot more intrigued by this game than I was a month ago. I will say that. I think Joliet Catholic's still the favorite to win this game, but I do think it's going to be considerably more competitive than what I originally might have thought it would have been.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously players are going to be confident. Even talking to Brian Coon this week, I mean, he wasn't given anything for this matchup. I mean, he likes his guys. He has 16 returning starters back from last year, and obviously, most notably, his son Carson Cooney, a linebacker, going to Iowa. So, that should be a fun matchup. Kind of learn a little bit more about both of those teams. Joliet Catholic Oswego on Friday night. If there was a better performance in week 1 by a running back than the Warren running back, Aaron Stewart, I don't know who it would be. I think he had like 270 yards and 5 touchdowns or something crazy like that in the first half in week 1. And now Maine South, who had to deal with Jonas Williams in week 1. Well, now they got to deal with Warren apparently they have an explosive offense. I didn't know they did those kind of things in Warren. Warren and Maine South, what are you looking at for that matchup?
Yeah, this is definitely a really interesting game. And like you just said, with Warren kind of demonstrating that they have the ability to put some points on the board. And I mean, it's not like they were playing a slouch last week. I mean, they beat Hersey, a team that has been very, very good and almost never loses regular season games at this point. So a great start for them on both sides of the football. Usually you think of Warren as a defensive-minded team that maybe they'll scratch out enough points against quality opponents to pick up these wins. And despite the result last week, I mean, I think Maine South's a really good football team. So, I mean, a lot of teams are going to have those kinds of troubles with Lincoln Way East. So Maine South's got to really bounce back quickly here to avoid that 0-2 start. I think, fortunately for them, I don't think their schedule is really all that treacherous the rest of the way. So if they did drop to 0-2 in this game, they have plenty of opportunity to recover from that. Not the ideal, though. They certainly don't want to do that. So just a really, really interesting game there just because, like I said, Warren's a little bit out of character for themselves from that first game result. If that's sustainable, I'll raise that eyebrow and say, boy, we have to change our conversation about, who belongs in the top of 8A in the classification, because right now it's a 2-horse race. Do we need to bring a third horse into that? I mean, it's a valid question, I think, at this point.
Yeah, it felt like in the past with Warren, they brought the defense to the party. Now, if they can bring a pretty explosive offense to join them, well, then we're on to something. I mean, they're going to be a program that's going to be a force to be reckoned with regardless, but maybe they go to the next level if they can have that. We'll see. I mean, it's week 1, but obviously a good start for them. A matchup that I'm looking forward to, interested in Lyons Township playing at Wheaton Warrenville South, both coming off of good week 1 wins. Lyons Township, of course, their head coach, John Butcher, was a great quarterback for Wheaton South back in the day when I had way less gray hairs. But a matchup there that they're kind of two teams in very strong leagues, the West Suburban Silver, the Duquesne. I think they're kind of like right there to maybe go to the next level in their conference. But, I want to learn a little bit more about them. What do you think?
Well, this is one of those games when you look at it, and both these teams got wins in week 1. That's a good stride. But I never like to say this in week 2, but looking forward, this game has a lot of weight for both of these two teams. I mean, I think especially for Wheaton Warrenville South, because if you look at the conference play that they go into, I mean, you can make an argument that there are 4 teams in that league that are or quite a bit ahead of them right now, even with where they're at. So if they don't figure out a way to not only win the games with the teams that maybe are a little bit behind them, but pick off one of those games against one of those teams ahead of them, they're on that fence then. It's really that's the situation, because, I mean, in the Duquesne, you've got Batavia, you've got St. Charles North, you've got Geneva. Those are 3 teams right there that I think are problematic to try to beat. And then you've got Wheaton North too, who picked up an impressive win over Providence in week 1. So with those 4 teams right there, Wheaton Warrenville South, if they were to lose this game to Lyons, needs to figure out how to beat at least one of those teams, as well as everyone else on their schedule, just to get to 5 wins. So, I mean, that it's way too early to use the phrase must win, but this is a really, really important game for them. And Lyons, it's almost the same conversation, because you talk about the fact that there are teams in the conference that are, right there with them or maybe a step ahead of them. And you just have that work that you have to go through for them after this game is over too. So Lyons and Wheaton Warrenville South and there's a laundry list of these teams where it's really, really advantageous for them to get through the non-con with a 2-0 record, just to give them a little bit of breathing room when they get into their brutal conference slates.
Yeah, it's one thing I've noticed. I mean, I look at the Duquesne Conference in particular, is their non-conference schedules by some of these teams have been really put themselves in a position where you said they really need to win them, but easier said than done situations. That game in particular, definitely stands out as a tough one. Look forward to that matchup on Friday. The Mid Suburban League, a league that our former colleague Kyle Neighbors, I think that might have been his favorite league. It was definitely in the conversation. They had some teams that had some tough week 1 losses, and there's setting up some interesting week 2 matchups. I'm looking at Palatine Prospect. I'm looking at Barrington Hersey. Well, Barrington won week 1. What are you looking at with some of those games?
It's just an interesting league, and it was one of those things where, like, you look at that league on paper, and you can kind of get a scope of where, where certain teams are likely to fall. But then you had a couple of really, in my mind, big surprises in week 1 that also emerged out of that league. Fremd handling Lake Zurich in the fashion that they did really surprised me. Schaumburg with a regular season win over Antioch. I think Antioch's lost like 3 or 4 regular season games in the last 6 years. I mean, so it's for those two teams to kind of invite themselves to this party means that, especially in this crossover period, almost every week you're going to have some really interesting games between these two divisions. And at the end of the day, I think instead of going into the conference season of this with a couple of teams that are maybe undefeated and are kind of trying to go through the string, I think you're going to have a bunch of teams that are sitting there at maybe 3-1 or 2-2, or maybe even 1-3, where you feel like on paper the game's a toss-up. So I think we're looking forward to some wild days in mid-suburban conference play when we get to the divisional portion of the schedule.
Yeah, isn't Fremd's quarterback going to Northwestern? I believe. Yeah, I mean, but teams like that where I know who's some of the big dogs, but it's those week 1 wins where it's like, wow, I did not know that they could do that. That kind of puts my radar up a little bit. And
Fremd went 3-6 the last 2 years. So I mean, I don't want to say it came out of nowhere, but you just kind of get accustomed to that. I mean, Schaumburg's won 5 games over the course of the last 3 seasons. So I mean, when you're establishing a preseason pecking order, there's a logical way to go about doing it, kind of based on past track record. But so far, logic is being thrown out the window in regards to that league.
Yeah, and they didn't exactly beat nobody's week 1. They beat some pretty good teams week 1.
Yeah.
So good wins there. Steve, before we get out of here, I want to look at some of the smaller school big matchups around the state in week 2. I know the Northwest Upstate Illini, obviously one of the best leagues in that area. I know Fulton Lena Winslow is a matchup that you and I are both looking at. What are you seeing there, and what are some of the other matchups that stand out?
Well, I think for a lot of ways, like, you kind of know although that conference has produced a ton of like state finalists and state semifinalists, you kind of know the pecking order going into things. It's Lena Winslow, and then it's everybody else. At least it has been for the last 5 or 6 years. But primarily the main contender to that throne over the last 5 seasons or so has been Forreston. And last week, Fulton went in to Forreston and dominated them in a 28-0 victory, which raised my eyebrow a little bit. I'm not saying I think they go into Lena Winslow and knock them around in the same fashion, but I'm very interested to see how it comes out, because I think Fulton is a pretty good football team. That win over Forreston confirmed that in my mind. And I'm interested to see how good of a run they can give Lena Winslow in this game.
Yeah, Lena Winslow also had a pretty good week 1 win, although, I mean, not entirely surprising, a good Lena Winslow. And I believe they beat Morrison rather handily in week 1. So that should be a good week 2 matchup. So a lot of good football coming up this weekend, a lot of good coverage on Friday Night Drive. See, before we get out of here, any final thoughts?
I think this is an interesting week once again for kind of getting a handle on confirming some of the things that we learned in week 1. Maybe the schedule doesn't have quite as much fireworks as week 1 does, but it has a lot of interesting games where you look at them on paper and you're like, based on what we learned last week, I think this might be pretty interesting. I'm not sure. I mean, I think there are just quite a few 50-50 games on the board this week, and it's just really interesting to get those games in the books so you have a better understanding of what teams are moving forward. And I think week 2 has a lot of opportunities to do that.
A lot of great games this weekend. A lot of good coverage on Friday Night Drive. You want to follow some of our other podcasts. I taped the West Suburban's podcast with Joel Bennett. You want to check that out. JT Peddledy, Eddie Carifio, and Drake Landsman will be taping a podcast where they look at some of the games in Northwest Illinois And of course, Friday night, Steve will be back on with Matt Rodewald for our live stream, which is from 9:30 p.m. to 11 p.m. On Fridays. Again, you can follow me at jwelge96. You can follow the Soucie at the Soucie. You can follow Friday Night Drive at FN Drive, and also on Facebook and Instagram. Before then, I want to again thanks everybody for joining us. Enjoy week 2, and we'll see you soon.